Say it out loud right now. Say it until the room catches the weight of it. They studied your weakness, yet you passed untouched. Say that back to yourself if your heart is still pounding, because your spirit already knows the verdict has been handed down. Even if your mind is trying to trace the scars, even if you are still looking over your shoulder waiting for the next hit, something inside you stood firm when the entire structure was designed to cave in. Something in you refused to break when breaking was the only outcome they budgeted for. Sit with that for a moment, because what we are opening today is going to give you the exact language for a trial you survived without ever being handed the blueprint. A real test, in the oldest sense of the tribunal, was never about answering questions or putting on a performance for an audience. A true trial, the kind that tests the temper of a soul, is a deliberate, silent pressure applied to see what remains once everything artificial is stripped away. Nobody hands you a notice. Nobody reads you your rights. It happens in the exact moment someone tries to leverage your past against you and waits to watch your hands shake. It happens in the silence after they try to starve you out, counting the seconds until you plead for a seat back at a table that was already poisoned. That is precisely what you walked through, and you cleared the chamber without even realizing the proceedings had begun. Here is the truth about why that specific ordeal was assigned to you. A trial of that precision is never wasted on the weak. It is reserved exclusively for those who present a direct threat to a system built on quiet compromise. You were targeted by people who needed your reaction to prove a thesis, to confirm their suspicions, to justify their own hidden cowardice. Somewhere in a room you were not invited into, two people, or perhaps a small, cowardly circle, sat down and decided who you were long before you ever crossed their threshold. They did not attack blindly. They studied you first. They took meticulous notes on the things that made you flinch, filed away every vulnerability you trusted them with, and engineered a quiet campaign around your softest places. They observed you the way a thief studies a house, mapping out the entry points, looking for the latch that was left unfastened. I need you to hear me on this. It was never an accident. It was never a sudden misunderstanding or a simple lapse in judgment. It was calculated. It was measured. It was built to break your spirit from the inside out, so they could point at the rubble and claim they knew you were unstable all along. There is a ledger for this kind of machinery. An ancient, unyielding accounting system that people spend their entire lives pretending does not exist until the audit arrives. Every engineered betrayal, every covert whisper designed to make you doubt your own sanity, gets logged into a record that no human hand can erase or manipulate. Call it the balance of cause and effect. Call it the tribunal of the universe. Call it the debt collector arriving at midnight. The label does not alter the machinery. What matters is the structure of the account. Someone opened a balance against your name without your consent, and they were arrogant enough to believe the bill would never come due. They counted on you being too distracted, too wounded, and too small to recognize the ledger was even running. They needed you loud. They needed you frantic. They needed you to play the exact role they wrote for you, the broken, reactive victim that makes their betrayal look like self-defense. What they received instead was an absolute, suffocating silence, a composure so steady, so cold, and so utterly detached from their drama that it felt like striking an iron wall with a glass blade. You did not know it while you were taking the hit, but that refusal to perform was the entire exam. You passed the moment you refused to hand them the show they had spent months rehearsing for. Let us reconstruct the scene with total clarity, because I want you to view this through the eyes of the presiding authority rather than the wounded victim. Picture that small, self-serving circle operating in the dark. Co-workers seeking leverage, a fractured family branch protecting a secret, or a group of friends bound together by mutual insecurity. It does not alter the geometry. At the center of that web stood one person who felt deeply, quietly threatened by something in you they could neither replicate nor diminish. Maybe it was your natural boundary. Maybe it was the unbothered way you walked through spaces without needing to beg for validation. Whatever it was, it acted as a mirror, reflecting their own internal decay, and they did not possess the courage to look at their own reflection. So they sought reinforcements. They found a second party, someone impressionable, easily bought with false intimacy, someone starving for inclusion and eager to feel important by helping execute a execution. Together, behind closed doors, they mapped out the campaign. This is the classic geometry of triangulation, and once you recognize the blueprint, you will see it everywhere in the human trial. It is the coward's weapon. Instead of facing you in open court, they route their envy through secondary channels, dripping subtle poison into the ears of anyone who will listen, exaggerating your flaws, rewriting past events, and softening up the room before you ever step foot inside. You felt the atmosphere shift, did you not? That sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, the polite smiles that did not reach the eyes. That was the campaign working in real time, a deliberate siphoning of your reputation, your peace, and your sense of safety in places that were supposed to be secure. They leaked half-truths. They turned a simple mistake you made into evidence of a fatal character flaw. They whispered doubt into people who used to trust you implicitly. And through every single stage of this sabotage, they continued to smile at your face. That was the sharpest edge of the blade, was it not? The performance of warmth, the theater of loyalty, while underneath the surface, they were quietly removing the support beams from beneath your feet. They were convinced they were untouchable. They believed their covert little enterprise was seamless, invisible, and entirely free of risk. They genuinely thought that because you were unaware of the whispered trial, you were losing it. Picture your life as a structure built with your own sweat, forged through every late-night struggle, every sacrifice, and every quiet decision to remain honorable when it would have been easier to be cheap. Now picture an intruder sneaking through a back window, attempting to move the heavy furniture around in the dark, trying to convince the neighborhood that the roof is falling in. That is all triangulation ever is, an attempted break-in by someone who lacks the keys to the front door. But here is the fundamental law of a true foundation. You can play games in the dark all you want, but when dawn breaks, the concrete has not shifted a millimeter. While they were congratulating themselves on their petty manipulation, you were quietly rooted, standing firm on a foundation they lacked the tools to even scrape. They mistook your silence for weakness, believing that because you did not scream, you were bleeding out. They were about to discover that some structures are built to absorb the impact and send the recoil straight back into the hands that swung the hammer. The turn arrived the exact moment they waited for your collapse and met an unshakable wall. That is where their entire architecture began to fracture from within, and I need you to absorb this beat slowly, because it marks the precise shift in the ledger. You did not launch a counter-campaign. You did not run through the streets showing receipts, begging mutual acquaintances to hear your side, or posting public manifestos to defend your honor. You did not grant them the chaotic, screaming blow-up they needed to validate their claims that you were unstable, unhinged, or difficult to deal with. Instead, you deployed the most lethal weapon in the entire tribunal of human conflict: total, uncompromising composure. You continued to walk into the room with the exact same quiet dignity, the same unbothered posture, and the same absolute refusal to shrink before their artificial tension. That maddening, silent stability was the single variable their entire formula failed to account for. Consider the dynamic between shallow games and master-level strategy. Shallow games are loud, immediate, and obsessed with visible reactions. Every move demands an instant response, a public exchange, an immediate concession. Most manipulators operate entirely at this low frequency. They rely on the sudden jolt, the emotional trigger, the immediate public spectacle that proves their hit landed. But you were operating on an entirely different plane. While they were celebrating minor, petty victories in rooms built on gossip, you were holding a position of absolute stillness. Real authority does not fight for space in a burning room. It simply steps back and allows the fire to consume the very structure that ignited it. Their whole strategy depended on your flinch, and the complete absence of that flinch broke the spinal column of their design. Now we must examine the second layer of this machinery, because these operations rarely exist without a passive accomplice operating from the shadow of the main offender. Behind every overt actor sits the quiet collaborator, the one who claimed neutrality, the one who looked you in the eye and said, "I just don't want to get involved," while actively feeding your private conversations back to the campaign. This figure is often far more treacherous than the primary antagonist, because their weapon is passive betrayal, disguised as diplomacy. They stay close enough to collect intelligence from your open heart, yet maintain enough distance to deny any responsibility when the damage is done. They thrive on the drama, because watching your foundation tremble makes them feel less insecure about the total lack of structure in their own lives. This is nothing short of spiritual identity theft in its purest form. They did not steal physical assets. They attempted to hijack your narrative, reauthoring your character in rooms you could not access, and substituting your real reputation with a distorted caricature designed to make their own quiet envy feel justified. And just like identity theft in the material world, the victim is usually the last to realize the fraud has been committed, walking around completely oblivious while a counterfeit version of their name is being traded in the dark. But they overlooked one absolute law of governance. Identity theft only succeeds as long as the true original fails to appear. Simply by continuing to exist in your full, uncompromised integrity, without adopting their toxicity, without shrinking, and without validating their lies, you became the living correction to their false ledger. Every single day you remained steady, their narrative lost authority, until the weight of the lie fell entirely back on the ones who invented it. Zoom out for a moment and look at the broader mechanism, because what transpired against you was never an isolated human grievance. It is a universal pattern as old as consciousness itself, documented across every system of wisdom and psychological law that has ever attempted to map human nature. Call it the absolute law of cause and effect. Call it the unavoidable balance of the tribunal. Call it the weight of an invisible ledger that registers every quiet action long before human eyes perceive the consequences. The operational principle never varies. Whatever energy is dispatched into the ether, especially the silent, cowardly, covert variety intended to dismantle another human being, does not vanish once it strikes its target. It sits in the atmosphere, accumulating weight, gathering interest, until the exact hour arrives for it to settle its account with the sender. There is a precise psychological mechanics to this as well, and it is crucial you understand how your own design protected you. Your brain operates on sophisticated predictive frameworks, continuously scanning your environment to anticipate threats before they manifest in plain sight. When a bad actor attempts to manipulate you under the guise of friendship or professionalism, they rely entirely on the expectation that your internal alarm system will be blinded by their performative warmth. They believe their smiles will override your instincts, but they severely underestimated the sharpness of your internal radar. That quiet, persistent knot in your stomach that you initially dismissed as paranoia was not imagination. It was your nervous system performing at absolute peak efficiency. It registered the subtle mismatch between their words and their underlying intent long before your conscious mind had assembled the evidence. That was not fear. That was your internal defense force maintaining boundary control while the threat was still in the shadows. From a higher perspective, this is the most predictable sequence in existence. The force that seeks to diminish you always utilizes the exact same playbook: covert division, whispered campaigns, and manipulating third parties to execute strikes they lack the strength to deliver face-to-face. That force does not fear your anger. Anger is predictable, chaotic, and easily framed as proof that you are the problem. What that force truly dreads is your absolute, undisturbed stillness. Stillness cannot be baited into an error. Stillness cannot be leveraged into a public spectacle. A person who refuses to be provoked out of their center is a person who cannot be governed, manipulated, or conquered by any strategy they possess. So why were you singled out for this specific crucible? Why did this precise, agonizing trial land on your doorstep? Never because you were vulnerable or easily broken. You were chosen for this trial precisely because you carry a quiet, unshakable light that illuminates the decay in people who have traded their own integrity for comfort. Cowards do not invest months building elaborate, covert operations against someone who poses no threat to their self-deception. They build those operations against the individual whose very existence serves as a silent conviction of everything they failed to become. Every ounce of quiet pressure you endured through this process was not an act of destruction. It was a process of refinement, tempering your spirit into something far too dense, far too solid, to ever be broken by low-level deceit again. Now we must turn our gaze to what is unfolding on the other side of this ledger, because this is the natural mathematical consequence of a campaign that completely failed its objective. This is not wild speculation or wishful thinking. It is the absolute, unyielding mechanics of debt coming due. Somewhere tonight, in the quiet hours when the performance finally stops, one of them is lying awake in the dark, unable to explain the heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on their chest. The easy sleep they used to take for granted has abandoned them. Their mind keeps looping back to your face, uninvited, at 2 in the morning, replaying moments they thought were long buried, questioning how much you actually know, and calculating how much of their secret campaign has already begun to leak into the light. That low, persistent hum of anxiety in their gut is not a coincidence. That is the debt collector knocking on the door of their conscience. They are watching their own environment unravel in slow motion, completely unable to halt the slide. Conversations that used to feel easy and fluid are now stiff, loaded with an awkward, unspoken tension. The very people they recruited into their bitter little coalition have begun to look at them differently, scanning their words for the same manipulation they once watched them deploy against you. Small missteps that used to pass without consequence are suddenly snowballing into major exposures, stacking up one after another in a pattern that feels less like bad luck and more like an unavoidable audit. The world has simply stopped shielding them from the consequences of their own character. The false narrative they built to bury you has become the very cage that contracts around them day by day. Underneath all their performative confidence sits a cold, sharp dread that they cannot shake off. They spend their days rehearsing quiet, frantic speeches in their heads, drafting long, hollow explanations and apologies they will never have the courage to send. They type out messages to you only to delete them before the final character, paralyzed by the knowledge that reaching out would require them to confess to the betrayal, and confessing would force them to confront the hollow caricature of themselves they have spent years running from. They are trapped in a prison of their own design, forced to watch you walk free while they remain shackled to the very lie they constructed to destroy you. I need you to internalize this single, absolute truth. You do not have to lift a finger to complete this outcome. You never had to. The tribunal of this life does not require your assistance, your anger, or your active pursuit of payback to balance a ledger that was opened the moment they took their first hidden swing. The universe handles its own books with absolute precision. Your only assignment in this entire ordeal was to survive the drop, maintain your position, and refuse to allow their toxicity to transform you into a lesser version of yourself. You fulfilled every single requirement of that assignment simply by staying standing. This is the exact moment where you must speak the verdict directly into your own life, letting it settle past every layer of doubt that still lingers in your thoughts. Affirmation is not empty performance. It is the formal decree that overwrites the lie. Say it out loud right now, with the full authority of someone who survived the fire completely intact. You are not the villain of their story, no matter how desperately they attempted to edit the script to make you one. You are not damaged goods simply because they brought their hammers to your foundation and realized the stone would not crack. You are not paranoid, oversensitive, or unreasonable for having recognized the cold shift in the air long before anyone had the courage to confirm what was happening in the dark. Hear this clearly and let it take root in your spirit. You are under zero obligation to explain yourself, defend your name, or hold a court session for people who never granted you the basic courtesy of honesty. You were never the problem in that space. You were never too quiet, too intense, too guarded, or too much for the room to handle. You were simply too grounded, too authentic, and far too steady for a covert plan that required your total emotional breakdown to succeed. You are not standing still waiting for their late, empty apology before you allow yourself to move forward into your life. You never required their permission to step into your power. And you certainly do not require their acknowledgement to celebrate a victory that has already been registered in the ledger. Let those truths sit in the air for a second, because there is more that needs to be declared before we bring this chamber to order. Feel every single word land with the absolute weight of a finalized ruling. You are not who they claimed you were in the quiet rooms where you were not invited to defend yourself. You are not bound by a false narrative written out of someone else's deep-seated insecurity and passed off as fact to people who did not know any better. You have not lost precious time or fallen behind in your journey because of the temporary storm they tried to trap you in. You are moving at the exact unhurried pace that a real, permanent foundation demands, built to endure decades, not to put on a temporary show for an audience. You were not weak for remaining kind, composed, and honorable while they were whispering in the shadows. That kindness was never a vulnerability. It was the ultimate proof that their toxicity failed to touch the core of who you are. Even when the room felt completely silent, even when it seemed like no one had the spine to stand up and speak the truth on your behalf, you were never truly abandoned. The invisible ledger was already calculating every silent hit in your favor, tracking your composure, and logging your refusal to drop to their level. You are not going to shrink yourself, compromise your boundaries, or quiet your light just to make their lingering guilt a little more comfortable to carry. You passed the ultimate test of endurance, not by fighting dirty, but by refusing to let them change your nature. Let us return to the house one final time, because I need you to see it clearly now, fully illuminated in the sharp, unyielding light of truth. completely free from the false shadows they tried to project onto its walls. Recall that side door they thought they had quietly unlocked, the heavy furniture they attempted to drag around in the dark, and the false rumors they spread to make your structure look fragile. Step inside that house in your mind right now and look at what actually remains. The foundation is unblemished, not a single hairline fracture, not a millimeter of shift, completely untouched by every bitter whisper spoken in rooms you were never meant to enter. Every single pillar you built with your patience, your integrity, and your silence stands exactly where you raised it. Look around the rooms you constructed through sheer endurance, the quiet space where you reclaimed your peace when the storm was at its loudest, the room where you decided to stay honorable, even when being petty would have felt like immediate relief. The space where your absolute refusal to react became the very weight that crushed their entire campaign. They believed they were staging a hostile takeover, but they were only ever banging their fists against a locked door, demanding entry into a house whose blueprint they never possessed the wisdom to comprehend. The debt collector does not pursue the one who held their ground with dignity. The debt collector pursues the ones who tried to break an honorable spirit and bankrupted their own soul in the process. That debt was never yours to settle. It belongs entirely to them, and the interest is compounding with every sleepless night they endure. You did not need to launch a counterattack to secure this outcome. You did not need to parade your scars before a crowd, drag their names through the mud, or exhaust yourself trying to convince people who had already chosen to be blind. All that was required of you was to stand firm in your truth, stay anchored in your quiet center, and allow the laws of balance to execute their function. The trial completed itself the moment you refused to surrender your character to their noise. So this is where the verdict stands, sealed and final. You walked through a trial engineered to destroy your focus, and you cleared it without taking a single step outside your integrity. And somewhere right now, in the quiet darkness of their own making, the debt is coming due for those who bet on your downfall. Let them lie awake in the silence. Let them rehearse the confessions and apologies they are too cowardly to deliver. Let them wonder how you managed to remain whole, unbothered, and entirely intact after they threw everything they had against your name. You owe no one an explanation for surviving a trap they laid in secret. You already won. Say those 3 words back to yourself one last time before you step out of this room and leave this weight behind for good. You already won. Not because you shouted the loudest, not because you got the final word in a petty argument, but because you refused to shrink into the smaller, bitter version of yourself they needed you to become. That refusal was your victory. That refusal was recorded in the ledger. That refusal is what leaves them searching for answers in the dark, while you step forward into the light of a cleared record. Carry this truth into your tomorrow. Every time an old doubt tries to whisper that you were damaged by their games, remember that you did not just survive the fire designed to end you, you walked out of it untouched. If this ruling reached the place in you that needed it most, speak it out loud one final time into the quiet of your room. You already passed. You already won.